Hi, I'm Johnny, and if you're watching this video, it's probably because you've got a leaking pod. Now stay tuned to find out why your pod is leaking and how to fix it. Now there are several reasons why there might be a leak from your vape pod, why your e-liquid is escaping out of your cartridge. So your battery charge could be low, you may have overfilled your pod, your coil might need changing, or you might be using a vape pod that just isn't well made. So even if one of these things is true, there's usually an easy fix. We're going to run through each one and show you the solution to your potential vape pod problem. So first, let's uncover why your vape pod might be leaking. So one cause could be overfilling the pod. Now this is a simple one. You might be putting too much e-liquid into your pod or cartridge. If you have an open pod system that you can refill with e-liquid, and if you overfill this pod, the excess vape juice has to go somewhere. That is usually out of the airflow. So another reason could be that the coil needs changing. Now all vape coils have a time limit. They eventually all need replacing. So if you have a vape pod with a removable coil, it can leak if your atomizer head has reached the end of its natural life. But once it needs replacing, the wicking material in your coil loses some of its ability to absorb your juice. Not only that, but the coil itself cannot vaporize your e-liquid properly. So as you draw, the e-liquid sits in the coil and there's only one way for it to go, out of your pod. Now a rarer cause could be that your battery is too low. Yes, a low battery can cause your vape pod to leak. And most vape pods use bypass mode. This is the way the battery sends power to your coil. The charge in your battery therefore affects the power output. As your battery charge starts to drop, you have to draw harder on your vape to get vapor from it. This means that you'll be drawing too hard and pulling too much vape juice into the coil. This will then escape from your pod or your cartridge. The next issue is you may also not be using the right power setting. Some vape pods allow you to change the power settings. These should be set to the optimum wattage for the coil resistance. If they aren't and they're set too low, as with your battery being too low, you can draw too hard. This means you pull too much fluid in and can cause excess vape juice to escape from your pod. Now finally, you could be using a vape pod that just isn't well made. You have to keep in mind what type of vape pod you're buying, especially when it comes to refillable pods. If all components of the pod aren't high quality, the coil doesn't fit properly, or the airflow is in a less than ideal place, they can cause the pod to leak. So now that we've looked at why it's leaking, let's see how to fix or combat the effects of your leaking vape pod. Now firstly, don't draw too hard. You have to vape like a vapor, not a smoker. If you draw too hard, you're just constantly pulling too much e-liquid through your coil. Vaping takes longer than smoking. You need to give your vape pod time to work. Long, slow, steady draws will give your coil time to do its job, and that should stop the leak. Now next up, make sure you keep your vape battery charged. Now this might sound obvious, but try not to run your battery down completely, especially if you have a vape pod without adjustable settings. If you keep the charge up, it means you don't have to draw too much. This will stop your vape juice escaping out of the pod. Now you also need to make sure that you always use the right e-cig power settings. If your vape pod has adjustable settings, make sure that you have the power set to the optimum range for your coil. Now if you don't know this ideal wattage, you can find it printed on the side of your coil. There will be a range of powers such as 5 watts to 15 watts. Just pick a power near the middle of that range. Now next on the list is always remember to change your vape coil. Now if you experienced a burnt taste, poor vapor production or leaking from your pod, the chances are your coil needs changing. And make sure you always have a spare with you and that you prime your coil first before vaping. Now if all that fails, then try switching to a leak-proof vape pod. When it comes to choosing your vape pod, pick one that has leak-proof technology. Now this will help combat any potential e-liquid mess. They tend to have fantastic airflow, really well fitted coils, and the highest quality pod construction. Now that's our top tips on fixing a leaking vape pod. If you have any other suggestions, then let us know in the comments below.